Okay, for those joining, this is the Affordable Housing Committee meeting of Wednesday, June 9th via Zoom. It is 7:06 p.m. My name is Mark Barnhart. I'm the Director of Community Economic Development. We have with us the Chairman of the committee, Steve Brathwahl, committee members Carrie Mackover and Helene Daly, Recording Secretary Gretchen Grothner, Planning Consultant Glenn Chalder from Planometrics, and we also have Jacqueline Page and Herb Limecooler, members of the public that are also attending this evening. So we don't yet have a quorum, so we can dispense with the review and consideration of the minutes, Mr. Chairman, and maybe move on to other items on the agenda.
Yes, so let me first welcome everybody. I'm glad you could join us. And we will skip down to item number 4, which is the Affordable Housing Plan update. And would ask Glenn to give us an update.
Great. Mark, can you share the screen?
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Enable screen sharing?
Yeah. Well, let me find where I did it. Oops. I don't want to share it. There you go. Did that work?
Yes, it did. Thank you very much.
Sorry about that.
That's okay. So good evening, everybody, for supporting our work in terms of preparing an affordable housing plan. I've put together this booklet, which is an inventory of housing related data. I think the purpose for us at this point in the process is to kind of talk it over in terms of the major findings and information that is out there. Talk about what we think it means, and then this information in whatever form we feel is appropriate could eventually work its way into the affordable housing plan. So at this point in time, the booklet has draft on it. We need to make sure that we're comfortable with the data sources, etc. We find ourselves at a funny time in terms of data because the 2010 census data is 10 years old. The 2020 census is delayed, and we're not exactly sure when that data is going to be released. Their census website indicates that they think it could be September 23rd, but at this point in time, who really knows? The other data sources that are available is what's called the American Community Survey, which is based on a small sample of the population on a rolling basis. And from that data, the Census Bureau estimates what the composition is of communities. As a result, depending on the data you're looking at, it can have a fairly large margin of error to it, which means the data is not really precise, it's estimated. And sometimes the data that we want the most precision on has the largest margin of error. So we've used the best available sources for this information, and we'll talk about that as we go.
Excuse me, Glenn, before you go on, can you make the share the screen larger, Mark?
I was just about to do that, Steve. The only reason I was hanging here on the front page is that all I wanted to explain to the committee at this point is that the data itself is broken down into sort of 4 major parts that we're going to go through fairly quickly to set the stage for discussion. The first is demographics. That's population related information. The second part is a housing inventory in terms of what the housing stock looks like. The third is a section on housing affordability. And then the fourth is in terms of affordable housing production. So I'm going to go bigger, but probably not that big. Probably.
And guys, I'm sorry, this is Heather. I apologize that I was a few minutes late. I completely lost track of time. And also Joanne is driving and she is not able to make it.
Okay, thank you, Heather.
Yes, and I do apologize. I'm so sorry.
Not a problem. Not a problem. We just started. So Heather Dabrowski, committee member, has also joined the conversation.
Yes.
So is this size of text, does that work? Do you think?
I can read it, and my eyes are bad, so.
Okay. So I think that as we go through this, the purpose here, most of the information I've tried to kind of summarize so we don't have to get too deep into the weeds on this. But certainly please make comments on a piece of paper or on your printed copy of this information if you have that, and we'll be able to talk that through.
Yeah, just right there at the very start.
Yep.
That first sentence, it says we're expected to stay fairly steady.
Yep.
I think we're in 61,000 territory.
Yeah,
I don't see how we can be 59.
Yeah.
You know.
I agree. I've also heard a 62.5 figure that I've just
so
heard it. I don't know.
the two figures that we use, and I did give Glenn a heads up. 61,740 is the American Community Survey from 2019 with as a margin of error plus or minus 32 people. So it's based on a 5-year projection, 5-year rolling average. So that's one that we consistently use. The Connecticut Department of Public Health has estimated our population at 62,045. So it's safe to say, I think 59 is a little.
Yep.
And,
Yeah.
The issue also, I think, with the population projections, I mean, all the population estimates, including census, includes college age population, but that's a fairly constant across the board. But I've also noticed that I'm not sure how their modeling works, but it seems that, we're seeing small but measurable increases in population over the last 5 to 10 years, and that's not reflected in their.
Correct.
Yep.
That's
What was the number you had from ACS?
the number I have from ACS is 61,740, and that's the number.
I had this 740 part. So I think the purpose of this graphic more than anything else was to focus on the historic growth in Fairfield. We're at that funny position between the 2019 ACS data and the 2020 census not yet being released. The sentence about staying fairly steady reflected what the population projections indicate for 2020 and 2030. But I think Mark and I are both in agreement here that the state population projections clearly have some flaws in it. This population growth here, which is quite significant, if you actually look at their numbers in more detail, reflects the population of, I think it's 35 to 39-year-olds.
Just going through the.
Yes, and you'd say, well, how could that be? Where are all these people coming from? And having done these projections in the past, you realize they're using multiplier effects based on prior population groups. And these are students today or in the past projected to move back to town. And it's so this is here for information. I think when the 2020 census is released, which will be during I would imagine before we're done here, that we'll update or go with the ACS data. And perhaps for the population projections, I don't think there's anything reliable. I have the ability to do population projections, but I think at this point in time, there's really no great source of information, and maybe we don't focus in on this so much.
Glenn, I just want to make one other point about the population. As you can see the growth, there's a number of people in town that have been in town for a long time, and when the population was really much lower. And their memory, when we talk about zoning changes and density and stuff, they think about beautiful Fairfield when they first moved.
Yep.
And they've got that residual sort of reluctance to accept change and maybe increase density. And we have to acknowledge that. That's all.
Well, is it accept change? This is Heather. Is it accept change, or is it to say, hey, let's make sure we keep the integrity of our town, understanding that there's a balance between the two? Because, Fairfield has exploded in many, many ways. And to be very fair, I'm one of those people. I've been, outside of like a 10-year period after I graduated from college, I've lived in Fairfield all of my life. And I see some of these changes, and it's heartbreaking to me because, I'm third generation, my daughter's fourth generation. So I think there's a really tight balance between keeping the integrity of our town and, in keeping it a town, because I keep hearing, oh my gosh, we're becoming Norwalk, we're becoming Stratford, we're becoming Stamford, and welcoming evolution as well. It's a tightrope and it's a tough balance.
Agreed, but change is really inevitable. It happens every day, and it happens to all of us.
We're covering population data, and it does, depending on your perspective. But one interesting thing, if you look back at the population in 1960 versus where it was in 1990, they're roughly about the same. So there was a big growth in population after the war, after World War II, and then it fairly stabilized and actually shrank in population for a bit before it started back up. So, we can say whether it's good or bad, but, I think we want to, at least at this point, stick to the data. So, and then we can go from there as to whether it's a good thing or a bad thing.
Okay, Glenn,
go to
back to you.
The next page, and roughly a topic is on each page. The next page talks about the changing age composition of the community. Again, this data in terms of our current median age, it's not as reliable as we might want it to be until the census is released. But in general terms, Fairfield's median age has been increasing, meaning the average age of the population is older. And this is not uncommon from what's happening in Fairfield County and the state of Connecticut and really in the country as a whole. And what it is a reflection of is the fact that the health improvements, both in terms of medicine and lifestyles, have allowed people to live longer lives. And at the same time, we have what we know as the baby boom generation, people born between about 1945 and 1965, which represent a bit of a bubble in the population, getting older into the older age groups. And so the median age has increased. Fairfield is younger than some of its neighbors. But again, if you start thinking about the state as a whole, et cetera, the median age has been getting older over time. It's hard to predict what the median age is going to do in the future because the state population projections really are terrible. They are broken down by age cohort, but I have very little confidence in them. So it's hard to really know exactly what our age composition might look like. And again, once the 2020 census comes out with its age breakdown, we'll have a better handle on the situation we find ourselves in today. And on that basis, if we felt it important, we could try to figure out a way to do population projections going forward. The most important reason I think to be looking and thinking about age composition is that people have different housing needs and preferences based on their age and lifestyle. And so when we are a younger community, we could be focused on starter housing, rental housing, family housing, et cetera. As we perhaps become an older population on average, people can be looking to downsize, to look at other types of housing options, et cetera. So I think the important thing that I would like for the committee to focus on here is not the specific numbers, because we have not as much clarity as we might like, but the fact that the age composition of the community is changing, has changed, is changing, will change in the future. And that identifies the possibility that different types of housing or housing options might be things that people would be interested in at some point in time in the future.
Mhm. Glenn, the CERC town profile has a breakdown of the age groups. Is that a reliable kind of percentage breakdown? Do you know?
They're pulling the data from the same source as Glenn. They're using ACS or census data for the most part. And it tends to be dated. Their town profiles are look back a few years.
Okay.
So I've used CERC data on the median age simply because it was an easy reference source for all of the surrounding communities, easy to grab. But as Mark points out, they're using data, and I think they're using the 2019 5-year ACS data, and we're already in 2021. So it's again, Steve, we're just at this day. I call it a data desert at this time. It's kind of unfortunate. I think the next thing I wanted to bring to the committee's attention was the composition of household sizes and types. So one of the things that we find is that while population growth in Fairfield may have slowed a little bit, what's also been going on at the same time is the average household size has decreased. So we find ourselves in a situation that even though our population hasn't been growing, I think, as Heather pointed out, we've got a situation where the number of housing units has been growing. And so that's what people tend to perceive in terms of growth and change, is the change in the number of housing units. So I think household size, the aging of the population, is an indication of change that's going on in the community, and a reflection on the people's sort of changing housing needs. Again, as households get older, they tend to get smaller, and as a result, they may not need as much house. They may want as much house, but they don't always need as much house, or they might be interested in housing options. So this is a trend or a factor going on that might actually call for action or a diversification of the housing portfolio. Again, this information was from the Fairfield County Committee or Commission on Housing Opportunities. What is that, Mark? FCCHO?
It was actually put together by RPA, their Fairfield County Needs Assessment. They did this household breakdown for each of the communities in Fairfield County.
I think what's important here is for people to realize that the data tends to show that more than half of all housing units in Fairfield are occupied by one or two people. So that's kind of a surprising statistic overall. And our sense of the households of the 50s and 60s that might have been 3, 4, 5 or more people are really actually a smaller percentage than they used to be. And again, we have a situation that there may be interest or need in smaller housing units because household sizes are smaller than they were historically. So again, food for thought. Any questions on page 4?
Glenn, the number of units occupied by one or two people doesn't necessarily mean those are senior households.
No, it could be a single college graduate who's renting an apartment. It could be a recent divorcee. It could be, there's all, again, the composition of 1 or 2 person households. I mean, the old census definition was what they called fossil Q, people of opposite sex sharing living quarters. So there's all sorts of crazy combinations. And you even think about, some of the TV shows in terms of 5 unrelated elderly women living together. So, okay, yeah, that's, possibly a large family, but it could be house sharing, a lot of other stuff.
We may be able to extrapolate further from the data, those senior households that are living alone, because that's might be an consideration as we talk about, whether or not ADUs might be helpful as a strategy for those folks.
So there's a bunch of different ways to do that. If we try to extract it from the census itself, it's 10-year-old data. ACS may be able to give it to us, but the other option that's currently available too, if we want to try to explore it, is something called PUMS data. And that's a public use microsample. The census generally masks data that could be used to identify, an area or a household or anything else. But they do make available a public use microsample known as PUMS, where you can actually query the data to come up with information. So it's not Fairfield specific though. It might be Fairfield, Trumbull, Stratford, and Shelton or something like that. It would be 3 or 4 towns merged together. But I think there's the opportunity, as Mark says, to kind of identify the number of senior households and their size and look at that going forward.
Oh, I'm also hopeful that we might actually have 2020 census data to rely upon.
Yeah, I think we're going to get it. I just went, Mark. That's the thing. But you and I'll make a side bet. The other information here was in terms of household income. I was able to put together this chart that compares the incomes percentage of the population in Fairfield at different income categories with the county and with the state. And at incomes below $125,000, Fairfield has a smaller percentage of the population than the county or the state. And again, it's just a comparison in terms of the overall information and statistics. The United Way also prepares information for what they call the ALICE population. ALICE stands for Asset Limited, Income Constrained, Employed. So these are people or households that are working perhaps at minimum wage jobs or lower paying jobs, possibly even 2 jobs. But their income is constrained and they have not been able to accumulate assets that might support housing choices that they might want or prefer. So this population earns more than the poverty level. That's a term that has some historic meaning, but they struggle with often the daily cost of living. And 28% of the population, households in Fairfield were considered to be in the ALICE category. And so that's more than a quarter of the households are struggling a little bit because they're asset limited, income constrained, even though they're employed. On page 6, we have some information here about the racial and ethnic diversity of Fairfield compared to the county and the state. Fairfield has less racial and ethnic diversity than the county or the state. And because median incomes can vary based on race, as a result, we again end up in a situation that that this could be a relevant consideration for the committee overall, and it's just presented here for information and comparison purposes.
Glenn,
Yes.
Glenn and Mark, so it would be particularly helpful, I think, if we could get some responses from the folks who are not white, non-Hispanic. If we could get Hispanic, Black, Asian, Native American responses for those who live in town and or work in town. I'm not quite sure how we are able to gather them, but we should make an extra effort.
I think I had a chance to look through some of the survey results today to see how the data was trending. And I did notice that some of the population percentages in our survey responses were even lower than our population percentage. So I agree with you, Steve, if we could perhaps increase our participation level in those categories, that might be some useful data for us. I've made a transition here now. Just a sec. Made the transition now into sort of housing types and mix, comparing Fairfield with both the county and the state. As you can see, Fairfield's housing stock is dominated by single unit detached homes, and they represent approximately 79% of the housing stock. The other 21% is a combination of attached units, 2-family, 3-family, and multifamily, et cetera. This chart over here says, well, if the state, the balance of, or the different types of housing in the state was considered to be the norm, if you will, how does Fairfield and the county compare with that? And as you can see, Fairfield has more single family and more 1-unit detached housing than the state does in general, and has fewer of other types of housings. And in some cases, 1/4 the share of housing that the state has. And so that information is presented here in this table down at the bottom of the page in terms of the housing mix in Fairfield compared to the county or the state. The next sheet looks at housing unit size. There are differences between apartments and houses. Apartments tend to have fewer bedrooms than houses do. And so there can be this bifurcation, if you will, about the housing best able to meet different types of housing needs. But 82% of the housing units in Fairfield are owner occupied, and most of those are 3- and 4-bedroom houses. 18% of the housing units in Fairfield are renter occupied, and 2-bedroom, some 3-bedroom and 4s, but also 1s. The 3 and 4 bedrooms can be houses which are rented. They're not necessarily apartments that we would normally think of. This doesn't differentiate in that way. It just compares owner or renter based on the number of bedrooms. So there can be differences again in terms of housing suitability based on the number of bedrooms in the population. Housing tenure, Fairfield has a larger share of owner occupied housing units than the county or the state. Yeah, 82% are owner occupied, 18% are renter occupied. And this is a estimation based on the census data about how long length of residency of Fairfield residents. They did find from the responses to the survey at the present time, we are definitely attracting the 20+ year resident at this point in time. That is the significant segment of our responses to date. The next thing I did was I looked at the mix of housing prices in Fairfield compared to the county or the state. And again, this is a share of units. So Fairfield has a smaller share of housing units which are valued less than $400,000 than the county or the state. And Fairfield has more housing units between 400 and $1.5 million than the county or the state. And then when we look at rental rates, Fairfield has a smaller share of units renting for less than $1,250 per month than the county or the state. And again, has more units more than that. So it's market data in the sense that this is what people report that they believe their house is worth, report what they're paying in terms of rent, and is really for comparison purposes, information for the committee.
And Glenn, just a point, when we talk about the county statistics,
Yep.
I don't know how much important that is, because the county includes communities that are not at all like Fairfield.
Correct.
Stamford and Bridgeport, and they have more influence on the percentages than Fairfield and like communities of Westport or Trumbull or Easton or Weston. And I don't think we can bifurcate it and get it down to comparing us to like communities. It'd be good if we could. But I just don't think we gain much by comparing ourselves to the county.
No, and the data was readily available, Steve.
Yep.
And easy to tabulate. The preparation of a representative grouping to then assemble the data for comparison purposes is possible to do. It's simply a statistical exercise. So I think as it comes time for the report, that may be useful for us. Right now, compared to the county or the state, these are some of the distinctions or the differentiations which are apparent for Fairfield.
Yeah, I was muted when I was talking, but I agree with Steve. And I don't see the relevance of comparing us to the rest of the state either. I mean, it could be considered interesting information, but I don't see how it has relevance to what we're trying to accomplish here.
I'm just, wondering, does anyone dispute the fact that we don't have much in the way of starter homes that are priced at, our own annual report each year reports in the percentage of houses that are sold at less than 300,000. So I don't find this particularly, it's interesting, but I don't think it's terribly surprising either. Anyway.
Right. But I mean, in terms of affordable housing, the kind of residents that we're bringing into affordable housing they're rentals. They're not even home ownership, so the fact that we're looking at, home ownership stats here and comparing us to the rest of the
I think you're right. In the sense that I'm not sure that you would draw many conclusions from this or have much in the way of implications for housing policy, perhaps.
Exactly.
So it's just information.
Yep. Then I got into the information related to housing affordability. And so the first question that people often ask is what prices are considered affordable? So Mark communicated with me earlier that the median income data, there's new income data that has been released. So these numbers may be off and we're going to go back and recalculate. But I think, Mark, I went back and did a quick look. I think they're within $1,000 or $2 of what the 2021 data is.
Yeah, they're not off by a lot. I just want to make sure we're on the same page.
I agree. And so I think I actually have a spreadsheet, Mark, that I'm just going to make a note here.
Yeah,
I'm going to email you the spreadsheet. That
I do too. I can send it to you because I get asked this question all the time.
if you would, I'd like to use your data. I have my own that I use, and I use it to calculate sale price and rents. But sales prices, as we'll talk about in a moment, are the trickiest part on this.
Yeah.
So bottom line is there's some terminology in here I just wanted to bring to your attention. First of all is housing is considered affordable, and that's all lowercase letters. If people spend less than 30% of their income on it. So, you know, if you make $1 million and you want to spend $300,000 a year on housing, knock yourself out, it's still considered affordable for you. The challenge we have is that what happens if people earn less than the median income? Because now the housing expenses are also competing with food, transportation, and other types of situations. Now, the second thing I think to talk about is that housing is considered affordable, all capital letters, if it's affordable to a household earning 80% less of the area median income. And there are some programs that work at 60% of median, 50% of median, 30% of median. So the issue is for these lower income households, the 30% threshold is relevant. So although these median income numbers are not the ones that we'll probably end up using because the data will be updated, if we run the math, the gross rent for an affordable unit at 80% of AMI is somewhere in the $1,300 to $2,000 range, and it depends on the number of occupants that are going to occupy it. So for example, a 4-person household is considered to occupy a 3-bedroom unit. That's a typical family where the couple lives in 1 bedroom and each of the children or each of the other members of the household have their own bedroom. So that would mean at 80% of AMI that the rental rate could not exceed $1,960 for a 3-bedroom unit or somewhere in that vicinity. And at 60% of AMI, that rent could not exceed $1,470. So it varies again by bedroom size and number of occupants.
Can I ask a question? How does whoever's putting this data together, what do they consider about investment income? Is that included in any way, or you just discount that altogether, or there's the assumption that nobody has investment income, or what do you
No,
do?
that's a great question, Carrie. So for the affordability plans that get created for units, there is a appendix that describes how those assets will be treated. And I think they do, I think they call it imputation of income. So they take those assets and determine what the reasonable rate of return or other things are to evaluate that in terms of its overall consideration. So it is definitely a factor in the equation, but I haven't gotten into the details of it enough to be able to speak intelligently about exactly how that works. But it is a factor.
Okay,
You can't have $1 million in the bank, cry poverty, and get an affordable
Right.
unit. Does not work that way.
okay, good.
The next calculation here, which I think is also important for us to think about, is the maximum sale price. This is worked the same way that you would have an income threshold, and then based on mortgage rates, mortgage terms, real estate taxes, utilities, insurance, condo fees, if it's part of a condo, you would then go through the scenario to compute how much house you can afford. There are 2 significant factors in here I'd like the committee members to be able to keep in mind. First of which is the state methodology assumes that an eligible household has 20% for the down payment. So even though they can only afford a mortgage of a certain amount, the state actually allows the unit to be sold at 20% more than that, or 25% more than that, because it's, again, a 20% down payment. That's a little, I guess, challenging, because lower income people generally aren't walking around with, let's see, $50,000 of down payment funds ready to buy a 3-bedroom unit.
Glenn,
they
so
can-
you're
they-
saying that that 3-bedroom unit could actually be sold for 300,000?
No, this is the market rate number. So in other words, 80% of 256 is about $200,000, we'll say. So it's a $200,000 mortgage that they can afford based on their income and all of the other expenses, including taxes. And that's roughly what the house could sell for because of the 20% down payment that goes on the top. The second thing I think is important and relevant here is that we are in a time period today of historically low interest rates. This calculation is very sensitive to interest rates. And so if somebody was to buy a unit at 3.5%, but when it comes time to sell, interest rates are at 4, 4.5, or 5%, or whatever they may end up being, that they can't afford as much mortgage. And so the difficulty in this scenario can be that lower income people get into home ownership and may end up not being able to recapture the purchase price or their equity. And it's an unfortunate situation, and just, I think, something that this certainly needs to be, I needed to tell you about.
These numbers seem a little low to me, but I'll go through those with Glenn. But I mean, the point that Glenn making is accurate, though.
And so, Mark, you know what I'd like to, I'll share my spreadsheet with you, you share yours with me.
Yep.
Because I think the assumptions that go into this are critical.
Yeah, they are.
And I carry, for an example, I think it's $100 for condo fees, which may or may not exist, but that $100 doesn't support the mortgage. So as a result, the sale prices, Mark says, could be higher. So Mark and I will come up with something that we're prepared to share with you and share in the report. So these are the basic numbers, or the ballpark of what we think we're talking about today, and we'll refine that as we go. The next thing I wanted to do is to look at the availability of naturally occurring affordable housing in Fairfield. And if we start looking at the census data in terms of units at different prices, it's possible that we could reach a conclusion that about 1,000 units in Fairfield are naturally occurring affordable housing. They fall below those price thresholds. I think we could probably map out from the assessor's estimate of market data some of this in additional detail, but we end up in a scenario that we could have 1,000 units or more of naturally occurring affordable housing. Now that's lowercase affordable, because they don't count, because they're not deed restricted to people earning 80% or less of the area median income. But I think it's important to understand, and the census data will help us get to this when it's released, is this concept of naturally occurring affordable housing. Housing in Fairfield today that meets these affordability thresholds.
Glenn, you did this computation analysis for number of naturally occurring units back in 2014, I believe, correct? Do we have any way of
check?
Do we have any way of knowing whether or not that number is increasing, decreasing, staying the same? Is that?
That's a great question. Let me go back.
I suspect it's decreasing, but I don't know.
Well, and particularly what's happened recently, Mark, with the run up with COVID and stuff.
Because we've seen a lot of, especially after Sandy, a lot of tear downs, particularly in the beach area, of smaller cottages and capes to make way for much larger homes that are selling for millions of dollars. So
yeah. Well, let me go back, because I think this type of linear comparison over time, using similar methodologies, et cetera, it's important. So I will take a look at that. The next information,
Glenn, I'm sorry, to go back to that naturally occurring affordable, nice to know, but it doesn't help us at all, does it? You know? It
in
doesn't
terms
help
of,
us in terms of how the state looks at it, how HUD looks at it,
no,
we don't get credit in
No.
any way.
no, there are some towns in the state that have, I think I did some work for Hamden where they have over 6,000 housing units, which are naturally affordable. The state says we don't care. It's not deed restricted. But that's, Steve, what I think this next category is about. So starting on this page, page 13, we have this tabulation of housing that counts to the Affordable Housing Appeals List. So this is capital A affordable. And the state credits Fairfield with 556 affordable units based on the database I have, Mark. So if you have new information or anything else, please let me know. So this is their report in terms of affordable housing units. There are 230, I'm sorry, I joggled the data there. The first category is what's called assisted housing. And this is housing that was built with public financing or public grants or some other program generally that restricts the housing to sell or rent at the target populations. 58 of the units are family and 173 are elderly. That's about 75% of the units overall are elderly or disabled. And one of the challenges we have at the present time is that many years ago, when these facilities were built, they were dedicated to an elderly population. They have been opened to disabled population, and now 50% of the population in some projects I have learned, I don't know about Fairfield specifically, are occupied by disabled people who are not elderly. So we find ourselves in a situation where the number of elderly, and particularly lower income elderly, may increase in the future. And we actually could have fewer units than we did 20 or 30 years ago to meet the needs of an elderly population. So just food for thought here.
Yeah,
But again-
and also the units that are there for elderly, were they built at a time when they don't meet today's elderly construction standards?
Didn't get into that analysis, Steve. I did do some work in another municipality where they recognized that their units had become, I guess I'll call it functionally obsolete. And I know one community where they had built units in small clusters with outside access to the individual units. But the units on the second floor were only accessible by an outside staircase. So in the middle of a winter snowstorm, if elderly needed to go out, it was a little treacherous. And they tore that down and reconverted the land into a more modern building with internal corridors and common areas and elevators and other things. So these are some of the considerations I think moving ahead is the long-term functionality of these units. This list really reports the number of units we have. They may not be perfect, but that's what we have. Now this number of units is going to generally stay stable over time from year to year. These units generally don't disappear until they're removed or renovated or expanded. The next category I wanted to bring to your attention is deed restricted units. And there's a couple of different categories of deed restricted units I wanted to share with you. The state database credits Fairfield with 124 units. There's 18 units that are restricted until sale. And so these units could disappear, I guess, at any time. I'm not quite sure how these work. Maybe Mark, do you have any additional insight on these?
Yeah, these are all units that are provided assistance through our first-time homebuyer program. So there's a deed restriction in place and a second mortgage that is ultimately repaid and released at point of sale.
Is it fair to say, Mark, that would those funds then be available for new first-time?
Oh, yes, they're available for, they were recaptured, those funds are recaptured and then reinvested.
So I guess my statement here, this number will fluctuate over time, probably isn't right? It will fluctuate, but it could stay in this range or grow if we're able to do more in the future in this area. It's not,
And in fact, this is probably a little dated, so none of these units, because of the nature of the restriction, qualify for moratorium. So we've not been as keenly focused on providing updates to the state on this list because it doesn't really make a difference if we're 2.5% or 2.61%. So.
But I think I misunderstood these units. These are important units because they can help us get closer to 10%.
Yeah.
And if we're able to grow this in the future, that's very important. There's another 88 units which are deed restricted with a specific duration. And these units, 2 of them are going to expire next year, 2 in 2024, 2 in 2025, etc. And there's some that have 99-year durations, but there will come a point in time where they could expire. So again, I think the challenge we have here is that this number can fluctuate. And certainly in 2054, we're going to lose 27 units unless we're able to find ways to preserve these. So it's just something for us to be aware of. Somebody once described this situation to me, the Greek mythology story of Sisyphus, who's trying to roll the ball up the hill. And so we're trying to create new units, while at the same time, we could be losing units at the far end. So we get the units perhaps for a discrete period of time. Again, important to consider. And then we're fortunate that 18 units, according to the state's database, are restricted in perpetuity. And so as a result, those units are not likely to fluctuate. Now, we also have about 200 units. There's 131 units which receive tenant rental assistance. These are lower income households who get what's called rental assistance from the state because their income is low and they have a hard time finding housing in the marketplace. They are allowed to go out and find a housing unit within guidelines that meets their needs. And the state makes up the difference between their 30%, what they can afford, and what the unit costs. And so when these people choose to live in Fairfield, we get credit for those units. And so we get credit for 131 units in Fairfield occupied by lower income renters. There's 70 units in Fairfield which have lower income eligible households have received a mortgage from CHFA or the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and they have chosen with those mortgage funds to purchase a home in Fairfield. So this can be a case where a naturally occurring affordable housing unit gets occupied by a household and gets counted. So again, this number will fluctuate from year to year, but I think that's how we get to our tabulation on the state's tabulation that we're about 2.47%, I believe, 2.57% of the housing stock. Again, this is subject to fluctuation, and Mark and I will check our databases to make sure that we're on the same page. The next page, which is page 15, is just a comparison of Fairfield relative to other towns in the state of Connecticut in terms of comparing the percent of affordable units with the number of housing units in the community as a whole. So if we look at communities of similar size, so these are communities which have ranked communities in the state of Connecticut by the number of housing units from the most to the least. And this is Fairfield in the middle with the next 10 larger communities and the next 10 smaller communities. And this is the affordable housing percentages. The average is 11.6, and actually Fairfield, I think, is the lowest in this group at 2.47 in terms of communities of similar size. If we do it differently and we rank the communities in Connecticut by the percent of affordable housing from the most to the least, Fairfield falls into this grouping. These are the 10 communities with the next higher percentages of affordable housing, and then the communities with the next 10 lower percentages. Fairfield, I think, is the largest community in this group. So compared to communities of similar size or similar affordable housing percentages, comparison from communities around the state. think it's important to note too that when the 2020 census is released, these numbers are all going to reset because the new denominator will be what the new census housing count is. We've relied on the 2010 denominator since the 2010 census. So then there's information that was prepared by RPA with regard to housing cost burden. A housing cost burden is if a household is spending more than 30% of their income on housing. And the information from RPA estimated about almost 5,000 owner households in Fairfield are cost burden, and about 1,500 renter households are cost burden. And that represents about 30% of all owner households and about 43% of all renter. Excuse me, this is a typo here. I apologize for that. Of all renter households. They put together this kind of funky chart, which is meant to compare the income band of the population relative to how burdened they are. And so, as you can see, that people who are earning over 80% of the area median income are generally not burdened. There's a lot of green here. There are some that are choosing to spend, more than their income on housing. And then, as we get to lower levels of area median income, we can see that the amount of pink indicating severely burdened increases significantly. So this shows the renter household distribution, and this shows the owner household distribution. I think the point to make from this is an intuitive one. The less money you make, the more likely you are to be housing cost burdened and severely cost burdened. And the numbers are larger than many people realize. There was also an analysis done of what they called the housing gap, and the housing gap is the difference between the number of units available and the number of households who need units without being housing cost burdened. And their information is a similar chart, and their estimation is in the different income bands that there is a housing gap of 1,600 units renter occupied and about almost 5,000 units of owner occupied, that people are bearing a burden in terms of their housing cost. It may be more manageable for some people, but if we consider that at face value, that's the number of housing units often considered to be the housing gap. And then the last thing I wanted to share here is just a quick analysis in terms of exemptions and moratoria through Mark's work in the database he shares with the committee on a regular basis. You're all familiar with the concept of getting to the 10% of the housing count to be exempt from the Affordable Housing Appeals procedure and the housing unit equivalent points, which will help get to a moratorium. And you're familiar with how the housing unit points are calculated, and the number of points can vary if it's owned or rented. The thing I found interesting in the data overall, as Mark has pointed out before, is Fairfield is very close to getting a moratorium as more units are coming online, so good for you guys. But you're also doing well with other units which are in the pipeline. And so if all of those units were to come to fruition, there's 1.6 future moratoria waiting for us after we get the first one. And so you're making demonstrable progress in terms of affordable housing units, and there can be moratoria which occur as a result of this. And I was heartened to see the number of 1.6. In effect, what that means really is 2.6 moratoria. If you get the first one, you're very close right now. I think it's just 50 something units or housing unit equivalent points away. But again, with the other units which are in the pipeline and coming, there could be additional future moratoria there at all. If we're going to try to get to an exemption, 10% of the housing units, and we have 556 today, we need to have at least 1,609 units to become exempt. And of course, that's going to reset when the 2020 census is out. But we're showing progress in terms of producing units and continue to move in that direction. So that's an overview of the housing data. And again, I think it's really for your information and edification going forward. And as the housing plan starts to come together, we'll be able to use this data to support and make arguments and explanations moving forward. I think the only other thing I have to report, Mr. Chairman, is that the survey responses are moving along well. Mark's doing a great job in terms of generating participation. It's anticipated that the survey will close on July 4th, and that week I will tabulate the results and get them to you in advance of our next meeting, which is the following week on July 14th. So the survey results will be complete and tabulated, and we'll talk about those at the next meeting.
Yeah, only thing I would say with regard to that is I left the survey. I didn't post a specific closing date on the survey so that we would enable responses. The committee had discussed the possibility of maybe having a meeting at a different time than the regularly scheduled meeting to accommodate perhaps other parties that would like to join but can't because of scheduling commitments. And so I'm not necessarily wedded to a July 4th closing date. But I think the idea is that we would leave it open for about a month and try to conclude things early to mid-June or
Yep.
July.
Yep, I will coordinate with Mark on that, Mr. Chairman. And so I think my next meeting with you will be survey results, and then we'll get into strategies, et cetera.
Thanks, Glenn. Does anybody have any questions for Glenn?
I have a question. Since you've worked in many, how do we compare to the rest of Fairfield County?
Gosh, Kara, every community is so different in terms of the circumstances they find themselves in, the challenges they face. So every community is a little bit different. And I think that's part of the beauty of Connecticut and part of the challenge that we face.
Yeah.
You guys, I hold Fairfield out to be a leader in regards to addressing this issue. You had your first affordable housing plan in 1988, and the language in there is still relevant and pertinent today in 2021. The preparation of the plan in 2014 was a groundbreaking effort that few other communities in the state had done that. And I think other communities people come up to me and say, you worked on that Fairfield plan, didn't you? Yes, I did. And they're aware of it. So I think we've been a leader in terms of addressing this issue. And we have some significant challenges moving forward in terms of land availability and other things. So my hope, I'm in the process of putting together a master menu list of what communities around the state have done and are doing on affordable housing,
Yeah.
so that we can look at that and pick an entree and an appetizer or mix and match as we think it would work best for us to come up with a good strategy for the next 5 years. So that's my hope and my goal.
Great, thank you.
Thanks. Steve, I think you're muted. There you go.
I am muted. I have a couple of comments and a couple of questions. One comment is that I work with some hotel asset management, and when we do hotel comparisons, we look at what they call a comp set. So we compare our hotel to other hotels that are close, almost exactly like ours. And it would be interesting to see if we could do that with comparing Fairfield to other communities. But I can see a problem because we might think of ourselves as being similar to Westport, but Westport's got a third of the units, or a New Canaan might have a third of the units. And so it's hard to find those that are really comparable. Also, the demographics I find fascinating, but it's really a picture of the past. The past is prologue, and we want to be looking forward. You know, what's going to happen over the next 5 years and how we can help address the need and in fact channel the need or channel the resources to the needs. A question for Mark for the next meeting, if you can, Mark, that over the last 5 years, I think we have like 50 permits a year or something for housing units in town. but some of them are single family, some are multifamily. It'd be interesting to see the number, the percentage of the new permits that are multifamily versus single family.
Yeah, I have that. It's actually higher than 50. There has been a decided shift, I think, as some of the committee members have picked up on in terms of, prior to the last, 10 years, the last 10 years, let's say, it was overwhelmingly single family homes that were being built.
Yep.
As part of small subdivisions or just tear down rebuilds. And, the last 10 years, particularly the last 5, it's been a little bit more mixed. There's still the single family home construction
Mhm.
and smaller units that are being built, duplexes, for example, but you also see every other year an apartment building, for example. And you can just, tick off in your head the units that have been built. There weren't any of those opportunities prior to the last 5 years. So it does fill a gap within our housing inventory. The question is, how much of that do you need versus other things? So that's the issue. But I do have that information and can share with the committee and Glenn.
And the other question is the percentage of affordable units we have in town, has it actually gone up or gone down? In our report to the RTM, we showed that in 2000, the percentage of affordable units was 2.71. And last year it was 2.47. And that was the mathematical conundrum that you run into if you build 100 units and only 30 are affordable.
Not so much. It's really a reflection, that percentage also reflects units that are deed restricted for a limited period of time or deed restricted upon, that go off restriction once they're sold. So there is some fluctuation with the numbers, but, I don't know if, the fact of the matter is we're less than 3%, and that hasn't really changed in that time period. I don't know if it's really that. I was upset with the state for not contacting me this past year for an update, because we do have some new units that should be reflected on this list, but for some reason, they sent the notice to a mailbox that didn't exist. I'm not sure why. And so, these numbers are undercount, but it doesn't really change the underlying numbers that much. So we're arguing about whether it's 2.47 or 2.57 or 2.67. It's still not a big number or change.
So Glenn, anything else that wraps up yours?
No, I think I'm happy to have had the chance to put this information together. I'll work with Mark to get it coordinated between the two of us. I'll continue to monitor the survey responses, and I look forward to talking with you about those in the future. So thank you very much.
Should we anticipate any kind of email from you between now and the next meeting?
It would be my normal practice that once Mark and I have agreed on closing the date for closing the survey, that I would tabulate the survey responses and deliver you a report roughly a week in advance of that meeting to give you a chance to kind of look through the data so we can spend our time, talking about what we think it means and what we do with it. So that would be, I think, I've been updating Mark daily on the survey participation rates and the responses we're getting. And so I'll continue to coordinate that with Mark, and then the next major deliverable from me to you would be the survey results themselves.
Great. Thank you very much, Glenn.
Thank you.
So we're running behind, Mark, but I'd like to go back and get the minutes approved since we have a quorum.
Yes, sir.
And so if I could have a motion to consider and act upon the minutes from the May 12th meeting. Was that Carrie that made the motion?
You like me too? I'll make the motion. I have one question. I thought we had talked about some sort of incentive. We had talked about I don't know, what were we going to do? We were going to give people a gift card or to spend money in Fairfield merchants or something like that. That wasn't reflected in the minutes. Did we decide differently?
Well, I don't think we decided. I think there was discussion about whether or not it was necessary to provide an incentive to goose up response. And my point, which I think was reflected in the minutes, since I write the minutes.
Okay.
With questions help, is that I didn't think an incentive was necessary, at least until such time as maybe if we didn't see a response, but we're getting a very good response.
Okay.
All right. So Carrie made the motion. Is there a second?
I'll second it.
Thank
Helene.
you, Irene. Any discussion? In that case, all those in favor, raise your hand, say aye.
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 And those opposed? Any abstentions? Good. So it is approved. And Nancy, I see that you have officially joined us.
Well, I've been on here, but I was unable to like unmute or put the video on.
I put you on
Glenn's-
mute. I thought you were getting some feedback there. I wasn't sure, so.
No, through Glenn's thing, there was nothing that I could unmute myself.
Okay.
My apologies.
No problem.
So Mark, you want to give us an update on Parkview?
Yeah, I'll be very brief. I think all of you are aware of the fact that the Board of Selectmen, Board of Finance, and RTM all unanimously approved the purchase of 3 additional properties within the Parkview Commons development and approved a $2 million note as financing for it. The note is the Housing Trust Fund is covering the interest and carrying costs associated with the note, and is on the hook in the event that when we go to sell the units, either unimproved or after being redeveloped, if we fall short of what we purchased the properties for, the Housing Trust Fund would have to make up the difference. But I think this would not have been possible were it not for the fact we had a Housing Trust Fund to provide a financing mechanism for this. So that really has been the game changer as it relates to solving this issue, which has been a problem for since 2012, since Superstorm Sandy. So I'm very appreciative of the committee's work in creating the Housing Trust Fund and the inclusionary zoning fee that helped to provide the mechanism by which we can do this work. So we have now purchased or in the process of purchasing 4 units. So we purchased 350 in the fall. We have 3 additional properties, one of which we closed this past week. We're going to close on the 2nd unit next week. And the 3rd unit, we haven't set a closing date yet. All 4 of those units will have holdover tenants for a period of time, some very short term. One as short as 30 days, another one's 3 months, and one is 1 year currently. So all of that will help mitigate our carrying costs in the property, as well as maintain the units and the property themselves until we're ready to move to the next step. And the next step would be to identify development partners with whom we can partner to redevelop the property, bring additional equity into the mix, and also developing a plan and then overseeing construction of the units once the development agreement has been reviewed and approved by town boards. We are also, my office is also talking to 2 additional property owners with the hope that they might be added to the mix so that we'd have a good core group as this first phase of development. So it's, again, thank you for all of your support. Again, without the Housing Trust Fund being there, I don't think we would have had the results that we were able to achieve. And so that really has made the difference.
That's great.
It is great, Mark. The 4 units, are they side by side?
Not all of them. So we have two that are contiguous and two on the other side of the street. All of them are 9,000 square foot conforming duplex lots,
Mhm.
which would be great if we were able to do this and build duplexes and make the numbers work. But again, I think the expectation, to their credit, all the boards, Board of Selectmen, Board of Finance, and RTM, were very much in favor of increasing the number of affordable home ownership units as part of this development. So to do that, I think we're going to end up having to do more than a 2-for-1 replacement to make the numbers work. And even with a 3-for-1 replacement, if those are 100% affordable, we'll need probably some additional level of subsidy. So we are continuing our conversation with the Department of Housing. So that's one possibility, but in the event we're not able to achieve, other sources of financing because of whatever, I think our backup would be to look at doing some market rate as part of the overall development mix.
Good. Any questions for Mark on Parkview Commons?
So again, thank you.
Affordable housing, no, I'm sorry, accessory dwelling units.
Okay, I don't have any particular update at the present time, but I hope to be able to start on it once we're past the July 4th holiday.
I will relate to the committee and to Carrie. I participated, we're part of there's a regional planning network that involves the community development planning professionals, economic development professionals from the New York metro area. It's basically an information sharing forum. And there was a series of presentations on accessory dwelling unit in the tri-state area. And Emmeline was also on the call, Emmeline Harrigan from Planning and Zoning. But, New York City planning has really great resources. And I'm hoping to tap into that because they've got a lot of great data. And they were studying how other communities across the country have incentivized the creation of accessory dwelling units. So some of that might be very helpful in our conversations.
I like the word incentivize, and that's glad to hear that. And if you've got any links to share, I'd love to see them.
Not yet, but I reached out to the presenters and asked them to provide, besides their slide deck, I want their actual reports and data.
Yeah, Mark, did you say that New York City had a lot of data?
Yeah, it's so this is an effort that's been in place for a few years now, and we were invited to participate. I think it goes in Connecticut, goes all the way up to New Haven. So a lot of the larger communities that have professional planning staff and economic development staff participate. But New York City has a really, top-notch planning department, and they have resources, and they've been very forthcoming and sharing a lot of good information and data. I mean, you can't always extrapolate stuff that applies at a city level, but they've got information that talks about issues that affect the whole tri-state area. And it's really fascinating stuff. I'm envious of the resources they have at their disposal.
One thing that I would find very interesting, if they have any financing ideas or financing resources. Freddie Mac.
They're not providing financing to us, no. I'm glad they're sharing their data and not asking me to pay for it.
Well, that's good too. But just any way that we can help make these easier to do would be great. Okay, the trust fund. Tell us how we're doing. Where do we stand?
Let's see. I have one of these sheets. Bear with me for a second. This came from the finance department yesterday, and they say our fund balance is $626,163.65. Now, I know that they've encumbered monies for the housing trust, the housing plan. And I believe they've also, that obviously does not include any recapitalization of monies that would have been laid out for the purchase of 350 Quincy, for example. And I believe it also includes in that, although I don't have the details behind it, I believe it includes some of the initial down payments that we had to make to put properties under contract. So I believe all that will eventually wash out. So we're basically at the same point. I'm surprised that MC some other projects come in because we have seen some larger development projects, notably the ice arena and replacement for Alumni Hall, both of which are multi-million-dollar projects at the two universities. So I'm not sure if those funds have been deposited yet, but both would have some positive effect, or should have had some positive effect on the balance.
Is it fair to say though that we've got like $1 million, maybe 300 is committed to Parkview Commons, so we've got 650 or so available?
Yeah, that would be fair to say. Yeah.
Okay. And has anybody approached you and asked you for assistance through the
We want to talk about something a little later. I'd like to get your feedback on a proposal.
Yep.
I don't know if we're ready for that yet. I could segue into that if you'd like.
Yeah, let's talk about it. Let's do that.
Okay, so a few months back, I had a conversation with a property owner here in town. She owns a vacant single-family home that is in disrepair. It's in the Tungus Hill neighborhood on Ridgely Avenue. It's at the end of a dead-end street, backs up actually to the former Kohl's building. And it's the area is a mixed neighborhood, single family, as well as some duplex units. It's a Residence B zone. So it does allow for duplex units to be built. Unfortunately, this particular property is a bit too small. It's roughly 7,000 and change square feet. You need in a Residence B zone and 9,000 square foot lot. She had approached me to discuss whether or not we could provide support and/or financing to construct a duplex in lieu of the single-family home that currently exists. So, one possibility would be, the easiest path forward would be to seek a variance through the Zoning Board of Appeals. Of course, the hardship there is they would be seeking a variance with regard to lot size, among other things, I presume. Hardship is a bit in the eyes of the beholder, but one possibility would be if it were under contract to the town as an affordable housing unit, one or both of the units to be created would be contracted to provide affordable housing. Perhaps then there could be a case made to support this request for a variance. I haven't, all I have is a site plan at this point. I don't have any other elevation profiles or renderings or construction costs or development pro forma. That would be I don't know if it would necessarily be, that crazy a thought, but but I just wanted to talk about it because it's really what she's thinking about or proposing is not unreasonable. But on the other hand, it would require an exception to our current regulations. And, I'm not sure how the committee would feel about participating in a project like that. But the construct I would see would be, if it were under contract to the town as affordable housing for a fixed period of time, one or both of these units, then I could see a way by which we might support that application. And perhaps if there were a need, after you did the numbers and you could demonstrate that there was a gap, that it would have to be closed somehow in order for both those units to be created as affordable housing. Maybe there's an argument to be made for financial participation in it as well. But that's about as far as I got. And I thought maybe it'd be worthwhile just having a conversation about whether or not something like this theoretically would be something you would entertain.
What number is the house, Mark?
I didn't really want to give that.
Well, I would think with eight, if it's
It's an actual application, of course I would, but yeah, it's at the end of the street on the, if you're looking at it on the right-hand side, so you can probably figure it out. But
Okay. I mean, if it's being developed through.
he hasn't made an application. I would just,
She would be able to bypass some of those regulations like every other 830G developer is.
I don't want to be doing an 830G. That's frankly, that's another conversation. When we set up the Housing Trust Fund, we didn't really set rules and say, hey, we're not going to participate financially no matter what the cause in a project that's a set-aside development under 830G. Right now, somebody could make an application and say, I need, some help. We could still turn it down, but again, I didn't know if that was something we want to necessarily be a part of. But again, this is something we're asking a board to set aside the rules that they've created, the regulations, and again, the town has done this. We did it in Washington Park for that 10-unit development. That did not conform with zoning regulations. I suspect that Parkview Commons will not conform with zoning regulations when we're all said and done. So it's not a crazy scenario, but this would be, again, under what circumstances, would we participate? Would we think about it? Entertain an application? Under what circumstances would we do so?
So, Mark, do you know, have they discussed, has Sherry discussed this with the RTM reps from that neighborhood?
See, now you're providing names too.
Oh, sorry. There's a lot of Sherrys in town.
I was trying to be, protecting people's privacy and such, but no, I think, again, we'd want to see some outreach.
Mhm.
What was presented to me is the neighbors would not be opposed to this. I don't know that. It would be helpful to make sure we understood the lay of the land before moving ahead. If that's an important consideration, I've already mentioned it, but again, if that's something we want to see, then I will make that known before they make an application.
And planning and zoning, have they?
I've had a very preliminary conversation with staff. It's out of the norm. I think, that's why a variance probably is the best route as opposed to a text amendment, because text amendments have effects beyond the instant application. So you're isolating this to a particular case and set of circumstances. It doesn't theoretically have any carryover precedent setting effect, but although people will claim it does. So that's, their thought was aside from an 830G, aside from, going that route where zoning regulations go out the window, maybe a variance application would be the best course, but they didn't, put odds on it.
I have two questions. Is there any possibility of acquiring 2,000 square feet from any abutting neighbors?
And that's another option we talked about. So there is a possibility. We haven't exhausted that. I suspect that that's not going to be successful. But that's one.
Okay. And my second question, which is really more of a statement than a question, but I think eventually this committee is going to get into financial negotiations about a lot of things. And I think it's almost inevitable just based on either providing incentives or becoming a quasi developer or somehow a matchmaker between developers and builders, that we will be spending money from the Housing Trust Fund. And it probably is an important discussion in setting parameters of that, whether it's, I wouldn't turn this down at this point because it may be the start of one way we begin to get into spending Housing Trust Fund money.
It's the intent, really, to use the Housing Trust Fund to actually preserve or create affordable housing or housing opportunities. But one of the decision points, and I know we put some guidelines in the draft application, was, and I basically said to the owner here, we would need probably both units to be affordable in order for us to participate. And, while we didn't talk about a length of restriction, I'd want to restrict it as long as we reasonably could. And, the other reality is, even though you get credit for these in the broader picture of affordable housing under the appeals list, so that 2.57 would be 2.571. Or whatever it would be, you don't get any housing unit equivalency points for a moratorium unless it's deed restricted for a period of not less than 40 years, which probably is going to rule out a lot of applications, because I don't think people are going to restrict anything unless they're a nonprofit or required to, which is,
Mark, do has any community or any developer tried to do a 40-year restriction with a, call it 20-year opt-out? That would be definitely restricted for 15 or 20 years, but after that.
Well, I think the only way I can see something happen. So one construct would be a 40-year term restriction with the declining balance loan. So we provide financing, let's say $100,000, 1/40 of it comes off each year. And at the end of 40 years, they owe nothing. So essentially it's a grant, converts to a grant. And if at some point they decide to opt out, this is how our rehab program currently works, although we don't restrict things for 40-year terms because we'd never get anyone to participate. If they opt out in year 20, they owe half of the money that they borrowed, or $50,000. So that's one way of doing it. I think if you were to say a 40-year term, but at 20 years you can opt out, the state would interpret that as a 20-year restriction. I'm not sure how they would interpret the opt out at any time thing either. They may say that's problematic too for a more, you'll get credit for the larger pool, but whether or not it would pass muster for moratorium is another question.
I was just looking at the lots on Ridgely, and there's definitely one existing non-conforming multifamily on 7,600 square foot lot.
Yep.
There's another two of them that are just slightly under the required square footage for multifamily, but that's something that could be used to try to get that approval with the variance.
Thanks. I mean, yeah, that it isn't out of character. It wouldn't be inconsistent with what you see in the neighborhood, which is a good thing. But yeah, I think that would be helpful. Thanks, Helene.
So
So I'm hearing like
Harry,
we should continue our conversations and see where it goes.
yes, yes. I agree. I agree.
Just as an aside, was that the house on Churchill that had a fire that we were talking about purchasing with Operation Hope? Is that the same multifamily?
One time I tried to get, one time Operation Hope was potentially looking at purchasing. I don't think it had a fire, but it is in very bad.
Oh, yeah, there was just a fire a few days ago, and I thought it was the
Really?
same.
Okay, then it's been abandoned, so having a fire in it would not surprise me,
Mm.
because it's been vacant for a period of time.
Okay, how about, how are we doing on our points towards a moratorium?
There really isn't any change in the overall points that Glenn covered as part of his presentation, which reflects our current numbers. But the only change would be, as you probably are aware, the project on Park Avenue, 5545 Park Avenue, which was turned down for a zoning regulation amendment application, came back as an 830G, which is actually what the Planning and Zoning Commission indicated they should do. And instead of 99 units, that's 120 units. So I would have to update my numbers to reflect that.
And that's pretty tall, isn't it also? It's like 6 or 7 stories?
I didn't look at I don't think it's that tall, but it's definitely multi-story apartment type building. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's probably on a pedestal because they have to put the parking underneath.
Mhm. You want to talk about 81 Black Rock Turnpike?
Yeah, I don't know if any of you had a chance to tune in to the Planning and Zoning Commission meeting last evening. I did not. I kind of had a scheduling snafu, I guess, but I was interested in hearing the conversation. They did have a pre-app before the Planning and Zoning Commission. Essentially, the 81 Black Rock Turnpike is a brownfield site. It sits right next to the Fairfield Metro Center train station. It's owned by a trust in, the family is in Florida. Had a long history trying to get the site redeveloped. It's got some significant environmental issues, legacy related to the Bullard's Foundry, which was located on that property. So this developer is a residential developer, and our current overlay zone within the TOD provides for an 80-20 split between residential and commercial. And the developer in his pre-app made a nod to doing some commercial, but very, very small amount, and was asking for essentially relief from the 80-20 split to something less than that, and counting some of the amenity space that would provide for some of the residential tenants, as well as the parking structure itself, count towards the commercial percentage. His argument is essentially the commercial market is slow, particularly in that area for retail. It's going to be difficult to lease up and make the call, make their numbers. And there's some truth to that, because it's an emerging market, and the retail and other commercial space is leasing up slower than residential. But that's not, I don't think that the commission is really going to go completely the other direction. So the other interesting thing that they propose, which actually is something that we should perhaps consider, is providing some incentive or offset for creating public amenities in lieu of the commercial space. And I actually like that idea. So, if you're going to create a public plaza or public gathering spot or public art, fountains, things like that, maybe there is some allowance or some offset, we can provide some relief that we can provide as an incentive to do that, because there isn't really a whole lot of public space of in that area. So outside of the train station amenities and whatnot. But it was just a pre-app, so it was really to get some feedback. I think they still have some work to do. This is again, I didn't listen to the actual discussion, but I got a recap from staff, and that's where we're at.
Mark, is there any way to get any affordable units out of that?
Yeah, they would be required to do affordable, because the inclusionary provision, even in the TOD now, we have a higher percentage than 10%. I assume that they would follow at least the 12.5 or 12% or whatever they ended up with Fairfield Metro.
Yeah,
So,
but I was thinking that public amenities, I think, are a great idea, but if giving up the commercial floor space, there would be even more affordable units, that the percentage of affordable units at the level of affordability. So rather than simply convert to amenities, maybe there could be another unit or two, or I'm not sure.
yeah, that would be another possibility, which is to increase the units as an offset too. That would be another way of providing a public benefit in lieu of. I just think, again, they're really, they're far apart. Really, they're not close to. I mean, if it was like we're doing 15% instead of 20%, I would say, yeah, we can figure that out between the 5% that you're short. I mean, to throw a restaurant in the front and say that's our commercial and everything else is residential, I'm not sure that's going to cut it. So I think I talked to the developer and said, honestly, if you talk to a lot of residential developers that are doing these types of projects around transit, they're building in, workplace, flex space, flexible office space, co-working space in the residential development, which is now considered a building amenity to the residential dwellers. So I totally don't agree with there's no market at all. That I don't buy it.
Yep. So Mark, the development at Black Rock train station itself hasn't started, but already there's Trademark has like 500 units. Is that right? In total, Trademark 1 and 2 and the one across the street? And
yeah, 100, 160. So you have 260 between the two of them.
And Showcase Cinema, which is really, but that's got like 300 units.
Yeah, Spinnaker's doing that. You've
Yeah.
seen that. Yep.
So if this one went forward, this would really be quite a hub of multi.
Yes, that would also undercut their argument that there wouldn't be demand for commercial space, because if you had that many residential units in a fairly compact area, people are going to want to have a place to eat and provide other services. So, and in fact, I think what we're seeing now, it was slow to rent up, but Trademark 1 and 2, they're getting, we're going to see some movement there. They've got a number of leases signed. I think all they have left now is about 3,000 square feet, which is a pretty significant change in overall vacancy.
Yep. Good. Okay. I have nothing else.
Yeah, I don't know if I have anything else.
I'm still working on the meeting with Operation Hope, but other than that, nothing else.
And that would be, one possibility, which was to delay our meeting in July to give us a little bit more time if we needed it to get additional survey and to collate those survey results subject to Glenn's availability for a meeting. And then by switching our meeting date, we might be able to accommodate Carla to attend that meeting.
I'll move it from the 14th to the 21st or the 20th or something like that.
Yeah, I don't know if, again, we haven't surveyed all of you to see what if you're going to be around on the 21st, so I know as we get it pushed into later into July, I'm sure a lot of you are trying to figure out where you're gonna go now that you're all fully vaccinated.
When speaking of fully vaccinated, does that mean we're going to start meeting in person, face to face?
I hope so. One of the issues is that the governor's edict or executive order that provides the authority by which we can meet virtually expires, I think, June 20th, barring some legislative action. I think there was legislation pending. I don't know if it passed. But I know what the first selectwoman would like is to have a hybrid, to take the best elements of both, because there are some advantages to being able to meet in this format, but there's also advantages to meeting in person. So I think what she's trying to do is make sure that we're technologically in a position where we can accommodate people who might want to tune in remotely and follow on that way, as opposed to just physically being in the building. So I don't have guidance yet, but she did send out a note to all staff and to advise commissions that we're still working on it.
Board of Ed had an in-person meeting last night.
Oh.
And they allowed 30 people from the public to attend.
Did they allow for people to tune in remotely too, or?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
So I think some of our facilities have that capability, but even we're kind of technologically not where we should be.
So how do we figure out if we're going to do a meeting on the 14th or the 15th or the 22nd or?
Well, I can certainly poll all of you to see what your availability is, and also to talk to Glenn to make sure that his schedule is free, and also if the point is really to accommodate Carla, we can certainly, I'll check with her. And then, if we were to do it, for example, that third week, that would provide more than enough time to, I didn't really want to survey closing on July 4th either. So, sometime in early July, I think would be a good date. We'll probably know when we start to see the responses dwindle to next to nothing. So.
Okay.
Does that sound good if I poll everyone and see what their availability is, and we'll go from there?
Yeah. Okay. So if there is nothing more, then maybe we would, I could ask Herb to give us another update on he has and I'm not sure what you call it, Herb, but you have another meeting next week with Carol Martin.
Yeah, so we've been having these Zoom sessions, Steve, that you alluded to, several times a month since March, and we have one scheduled on the 15th. And I had written to all the committee members this week to advise them of it, and the FSA leadership knows of it. And then we're going to do a blast email tomorrow that we were talking about before, and in which we'll push the survey. But in that, we'll announce that the session with Carol would cover, the status of affordable units. We want to talk about their perception of the housing crisis that exists, that she and Carla and others noted in their recent press release. Wanted to get actually want to engage with her about what data that they're relying upon in terms of assessing the degree of crisis, how we could maybe help in terms of furthering available data, and just talk generally about how we could be of help in terms of as advocates, and whatever else people want to suggest. So I've got a note out to Carla to see if she would be available also. If she's not, then we could have scheduled a similar meeting with Carla later, but we obviously want to see first how the meeting that this committee is having with Carla goes.
Okay.
So
And
it's I'm sorry, it's It's Tuesday, the 15th at 4:00. And if there are any updates at all in terms of the agenda, I'll let everyone know, but that's what we're currently thinking. And this, you're all in this, these releases that we sent out to one of our blast emails, and the agenda is listed on that tomorrow.
And the Zoom instructions are in the blast, the email blast?
Yes, it'll just be, all you'll need to do is to click,
Yeah.
and you should be good to go.
Great. Thanks, sir.
Sure.
Okay, with that, we'll wrap it up.
I would just say thank you to those of you who have been sharing the survey link. I know Helene's been posting that on Facebook and other places. So keep, if you know of other contacts, other places we should be providing outreach to a group or whatnot.
Yeah, I'm gonna share that to a few more pages. How did we, I'm sorry for asking this, I should know it. How did we send that out to the town? Did we mail it?
It went out as a press release and then in Brenda's newsletter, and some of the press picked up on it. I know Steve was interviewed by a reporter for the Connecticut Post, Fairfield Citizen News, so I suspect we'll probably see an article in there shortly. And now I'm just reaching out to different groups that I know of, anyone pretty much. So I'd encourage you to do the same. I'm happy to send out some draft, some wording that you can then share with your contacts if you'd like, or just provide them the link and say, hey, fill it out if you could. So appreciate it.
And
Mark, I should know this. Is it appearing in Julie DeMarco's
Yes.
weekly newsletter?
Yeah, I reached out to the rec department, the library, Pequot Library, and Senior Center, all of whom have fairly robust email list or newsletters, and asked them to post or share, and they've all agreed to do that. And then I've been reaching out to other groups. I didn't quite get down to the civic clubs yet, but we'll do that, and started contacting neighborhood associations as well.
And Mark, it was in the Fairfield Patch, and I clicked on the Survey Monkey link, and it was really seamless. Went right to it, no problems at all. And so I'm hoping that kind of access works no matter where the notice is posted.
Hope so.
I'll send it to Fran Cormier at
Oh,
Fairfield.
thank you. Yeah, I had her on my list, but if you'll do that, that'd be awesome.
We'll put it in her Monday morning memo.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you all. Have a good evening.
Thank you. We're
Right.
adjourned at 8:55. Great. Thank you all. Have a good night.
Thanks,
Make a
everyone.
motion